The wheel of white cheese sat on the courthouse table while 3 judges leaned close, knives ready. Outside, 100 ranchers waited in the August heat, the same men who had laughed at her 2 summers past. Margaret Doyle pressed her cracked hands flat against her apron and did not look away. Everything she owned now rested on a thing nobody had wanted. 2 summers earlier, before any of it, her husband Aaron had stood at the rail fence watching their neighbor's fine cow graze. "A man works with what he can afford," Margaret said quietly, "not what he wishes he had." Aaron shook his head. He wanted the cow. He wanted what other men respected. She watched a thistle bend in the dry wind, tough where the grass had already burned away, and thought, there is worth in what the world overlooks. You only have to see it. The Doyle place sat on the worst 40 acres in the Bitter Creek Valley, ground so rocky and steep that the previous owner had walked away from it owing 2 years of taxes. Aaron had bought it cheap because cheap was all they had. Their savings amounted to $31 knotted into a sock beneath the floorboard, and that sock grew lighter every season. Margaret had come west from a dairying family in Wisconsin. She knew milk the way some women knew scripture, knew the way cream rose and soured and turned, knew the smell of a clean churn and the smell of one gone wrong. But knowing milk meant nothing without an animal to give it, and the land they owned could not feed a proper cow. The good grass grew down in the bottoms where the wealthy ranchers held title. What grew on the Doyle slopes was scrub, thistle and clover gone woody, wild mustard, ragged weeds the cattlemen cursed. Their neighbors were prosperous and certain of themselves. Chief among them was Howell Briggs, who ran 400 head of cattle and spoke at the church socials as though the valley were his parlor. Briggs had a way of smiling at the Doyles that made Margaret's neck go hot. He had offered, more than once, to buy their 40 acres, to spare them the embarrassment. Aaron had refused, but each refusal cost him something. He was a proud man, wearing thin. There was also the widow Pruitt, who lived alone past the creek bend, with a child too sickly to thrive, and who had no man and no herd, and was therefore beneath the valley's notice. Margaret had brought her bread once and been treated ever after as a friend. That spring the rains failed early. By June the bottoms were already yellowing, and the men talked of a hard summer with the particular gravity of those who have money to lose. Margaret listened at the edges of these conversations and counted in her head the dwindling dollars in the sock. Aaron wanted a milk cow. A single good cow, he said, could keep them in butter and cream and a little cash besides. Margaret did not argue with the wanting. She only knew that the cow he dreamed of cost $60 they did not have, and would starve on the grass they could not grow, and would give nothing in a drought but trouble. She kept these thoughts folded small, and waited. The auction at Caldwell's stockyard was meant to settle a bankrupt rancher's debts. Aaron went hoping a decent cow might sell cheap. Margaret went because she went where Aaron went. The cow sold for $55 to a man from the next county. Aaron's shoulders dropped. But at the far pen, ignored by every buyer, stood 37 goats. Thin, scabbed, ribs showing through patchy hides. They were the dead rancher's afterthought, kept for brush clearing, and no one wanted them. The auctioneer could raise no bid at all. $2 the lot, he finally called, half joking. Somebody take these poor creatures off my hands. Margaret looked at those goats a long moment. She looked at their mouths, at the way one was already stretching to crop a thistle through the rails. Then she heard her own voice ring across the yard, clear and certain. $2, she said. We'll take them. The yard went quiet, then loud with laughter. Men slapped their knees. Howell Briggs, leaning against the rails in a clean linen shirt, tipped his hat back and grinned wide enough for the whole county to see. 37 goats, he called out. Now there's a woman who knows a bargain. A cow won't have you, so you'll milk the brush eaters." The laughter rolled again. "Doyle, your wife's got a head for business." Aaron's face burned a deep red. On the wagon seat going home, he would not speak. The goats trailed behind on a long rope, stumbling, bleating, raising a thin trail of dust. When at last he spoke, his voice was tight. $2 I'll never see again. Margaret, what were you thinking? Goats. Folks'll laugh us clear out of the valley. They laughed already, she said. A cow gives 4 gallons a day, a real animal, a thing a man's not ashamed of. A cow gives nothing if it starves. She kept her eyes on the road. Our land won't feed a cow, Aaron. You know it won't. But look at them. She nodded back at the herd. Already, even half-starved and worn from the road, the goats were tearing at the weeds along the verge, the tough growth a cow would step over. They eat what we've got. They eat what nobody else wants. That's the whole secret of it. Secret of what? Of being the joke of 3 townships? She was quiet a moment. The hurt in him was real, and she did not want to trample it. When I was a girl, she said, my grandmother kept goats alongside the cows. Folks in town thought it common, but she made a cheese from that goat's milk. Hard, white, pressed firm, and it kept through the worst summers when every churn of butter in the county turned. She sold it when no one else had a thing to sell. She turned to him. Milk spoils, butter spoils, but a hard cheese, made right, will outlast the heat. And the heat is coming, Aaron. Everyone says so. He chewed on this. She watched him want to believe and fear too. And if you're wrong, he said, if they give no milk worth the name, we've $2 less and a yard full of mouths to feed. They feed themselves, she said. That's the beauty. We risk nothing but the pride we've already lost. She touched his arm. Give me the summer. One summer. If I'm wrong, we'll sell them for what we can and never speak of it. The wagon creaked on. After a long while, Aaron nodded once, barely. So the goats came to the Doyle place, and Margaret threw herself into them as though they were the answer to a question she had carried unspoken for years. She mended the old brush corral with scrap wood and wire. She walked the herd up the rocky slopes at dawn and watched, amazed as they fanned across ground she had thought worthless, stripping thistle, browsing clover and wild mustard, climbing to crop growth no cow would ever reach. They did not merely survive on it. Within 2 weeks their hides began to fill out, their eyes brightened, the scabs healed clean. And in the 3rd week, when the first nannies freshened and Margaret carried in her first pail of milk, she dipped a finger, tasted, and stood very still. It was the widow Pruitt who first shared in it. She came across the creek that 3rd week, drawn by curiosity and her own hunger, her thin boy holding her skirt. Margaret gave them milk warm from the pail. The boy drank 2 cups and asked for a 3rd. He keeps it down, the widow said, wondering. Cow's milk always troubled him. This he keeps down. The 2 women looked at each other over the child's head. In that look passed something Margaret had not felt since Wisconsin. The company of another set of hands, another mind. The widow began coming daily. She would matter more than either of them yet knew. The milk was extraordinary. Margaret had tasted a great deal of milk in her life, and this was richer than any of it. Sweeter, with a clean, grassy depth she could only attribute to the wild forage. The cattle of the valley ate timothy and bottom grass, and gave a thin, pale milk in the heat. Her goats ate thistle and clover and mustard flour, and gave milk that coated the tongue like cream. But milk, however fine, would not last a day in the August that was coming. Margaret knew what she had to make of it. The question was how, with nothing. She had no proper dairy, no copper kettle, no cheesecloth, no press. What she had was a frontier woman's inventory of make-do. She took stock one morning, spreading her possessions across the rough plank table while Aaron watched, half skeptical, half curious, For a kettle, she scoured the largest of their two cookpots until it shone. For the gentle heat the curd required, she built a low fire pit behind the house and rigged a grate from wagon wheel spokes so the pot would sit above the coals, never on them. For rennet, the agent that turned milk to curd, she drew on her grandmother's teaching, using a portion dried and prepared from one of the goats they had to put down for lameness, wasting nothing, as her family had always done. For cloth to drain the curd, she sacrificed an old muslin petticoat, boiled white, and cut into squares. The press gave her the most trouble. A hard cheese must be pressed, and pressed hard for days, to drive out the moisture that let summer spoil the rest. She and Aaron puzzled over it together. The first time she noticed that he had truly leaned into the work rather than enduring it. It was Aaron, in the end, who solved it. He took 2 stout planks of scrap oak and bored holes at the corners. Through the holes he ran 4 lengths of threaded rod he had salvaged from a broken hay rake. A round of cheese, wrapped in muslin and set in a hooped form between the planks, could be squeezed by tightening the nuts on the rods, turn by turn, tighter each day. It was crude and rusty and ugly, and it worked. "Look at that," Aaron said, stepping back from it, and for the first time in a season there was something like pride in his voice. "It's not pretty. Pretty doesn't keep through August," Margaret said. Her first attempt failed. She heated the milk too fast, and the curd came out tough and squeaking, the whey cloudy. The wheel she pressed from it cracked as it dried and tasted of nothing. She fed it to the pigs and started again. Her second attempt she heated slow, watching the milk the way you watch a sleeping child, judging its readiness by the feel of it against her wrist. She added the rennet and waited while it set to a trembling custard. She cut the curd into even cubes with a long knife, gently, and let it rest, and watched the golden whey rise clean and clear around it. This time she knew, before she'd even drained it, that she had it right. The curd was firm and sweet, and smelled of the high pasture. She packed it into the muslin-lined form, set it in Aaron's press, and began to turn the nuts. Whey ran out in a steady stream and pattered into the pail beneath. Each morning and each evening she tightened the press another quarter turn. After 3 days, she drew out a pail dense round the size of a dinner plate, firm enough to knock with a knuckle. She salted it well, salt being the other great enemy of spoilage, and set it on a board in the coolest corner of the root cellar to age and dry. A rind began to form, smooth and pale gold. The widow Pruitt watched all of this with the close attention of a woman who had nothing, and therefore noticed everything. She proved to have clever hands. She learned to cut curd as evenly as Margaret. She suggested rubbing the rinds with a little salt brine each day, a thing her own mother had done with a country cheese back east, and it made the rinds tougher and the cheeses keep better still. By July, the cellar held a dozen wheels, and the slope teemed with healthy goats and a crop of bright spring kids. Aaron walked the herd now without being asked. The laughter of the valley had not stopped, but in the Doyle yard, for the first time, there was the smell of something working. The test of it all came with the weather, and the weather came hard. July ended in a wall of heat such as the valley had not known in 20 years. The sun rose white and stayed white. The bottoms, already thinned by the failed spring rains, burned to straw. The creek dropped to a trickle. By the second week of August, the thermometer on the church porch read past 100 in the shade 3 days running, and there was no shade to speak of. For the cattlemen, it was ruin in slow motion. The bottom grass their herds depended on withered to nothing, and the cattle grew gaunt and listless. Worse for the dairy families was the milk. Milk in that heat soured before it could be skimmed. Butter came out of the churn soft and rancid and would not hold. Cream turned in hours. The women of the valley fought a losing battle against spoilage in their spring houses and cellars, and lost day after day, pouring sour milk to the hogs and watching their butter money evaporate in the shimmering air. The Doyle goats, meanwhile, hardly seemed to notice the heat. They sought the scant shade in the midday and browsed the tough hillside growth morning and evening, and the wild forage, deep-rooted, stayed greener far longer than the shallow bottom grass. The herd kept giving milk. Not as much, every creature gave less in such heat, but steady and still rich. And the cheese kept. That was the wonder of it, the thing Margaret had staked everything on and now watched come true. While every churn of butter in the valley turned to grease, her hard white wheels sat in the cool dark of the cellar and did not spoil. The salt and the pressing and the patient drying had driven out the moisture that the heat fed upon. A wheel 2 months old was firmer and sharper than a wheel of one, and better for the keeping. Heat that destroyed everything soft only ripened her cheese toward something finer. Margaret cut into a mature wheel one evening to test it, and the smell that rose was nutty and clean and complex. Nothing like the bland young curd. She gave a sliver to Aaron, and a sliver to the widow, and a sliver to the boy. Aaron chewed slowly, his eyes far away. "I've never tasted the like," he said. "Not from any cow." The widow's boy, who had been sickly all his short life and could keep down little, ate his portion and asked for more, and his cheeks had filled out that summer, and his mother had to turn away so they would not see her face. Word of all this should have spread on its own, but pride is slow to admit it is hungry. The valley would have let the Doyles eat their strange cheese alone forever, rather than ask for a taste. It was the widow Pruitt who broke the silence, in the end, and not by intention. She carried a small wheel to the general store at Caldwell's Crossing, to trade for thread and needles, having no cash. The storekeeper, Mr. Pratt, was a cautious man with a wife who kept a sharp household. He took the cheese doubtfully, set it on his counter, and was still eyeing it when a teamster came through. A big, dusty man hauling freight to the mining camps in the hills. Men who paid hard money for any food that would survive a week in a hot wagon. The teamster saw the wheel, asked to taste it, and tasted it. He went still, much as Margaret had gone still the first time. He asked Pratt where such cheese came from, and what it cost, and whether there was more. The miners, he told Pratt, would pay good coin for a food that won't spoil between here and the camps. Bread molds, meat rots. Butter's a joke in this heat. But this, he turned the wheel in his big hands. This'd ride a week in my wagon and come out the better for it. You get me cheese like this, regular, and I'll take all you can press. Pratt, who had a merchant's nose for money, even when it embarrassed his social opinions, sent his boy running across the valley that same afternoon to find the widow. And the widow brought the boy onto the Doyle place. And so it was that Margaret stood in her own dooryard at dusk and heard, from a sweating store boy, that a freighter wanted to buy every wheel of cheese she could make. She looked at Aaron. Aaron looked at the cellar, where 24 pale wheels sat aging in the dark, untroubled by the heat that had broken half the valley. "Well," he said softly. "Well, now."
The teamster's name was Boggs, and he came himself the next morning. He tasted 3 wheels, named a price that made Aaron sit down on the porch step, and bought every aged round in the cellar on the spot, $11.40 in hard silver coin. More cash than the Doyles had held at one time in 2 years. He wanted more. He wanted all they could make, every week, through the season and beyond. The mining camps were hungry and growing, and there was no other food that traveled like this. Margaret stood in the yard with the silver heavy and warm in her palm. The thing nobody had wanted was now the one thing the country could not get enough of. She had been right, and everything was about to get harder.
Success on the frontier did not go unnoticed, and it did not go unenvied. The first change was in the valley's manner toward the Doyles. The laughter stopped, which should have been a relief, but what replaced it was worse. A watchful, grudging attention. Men who had mocked the goats now rode slowly past the Doyle slopes, counting the herd, noting the spring kids that had doubled their number. Women who had pitied Margaret now found reasons not to speak to her at the church social. Their pity curdled into something sourer when they saw the silver she laid down at Pratt's store, while their own butter money had melted away in the heat. Howell Briggs felt it most keenly. He was a man who measured himself by being the valley's first in all things, and it galled him beyond bearing that the poorest family on the worst land had found the one trade that thrived, while his own cattle stood gaunt in the burned bottoms. He had laughed loudest at the auction. Now the memory of that laughter sat in him like a stone. He came to call on a pretense of neighborliness, sitting his fine horse in the Doyle yard and declining to dismount. He admired the herd in a voice that did not admire it. He asked idly how much Boggs was paying. He let it be known that he too was thinking of getting into goats, that he had the land and the capital to do it on a proper scale, not this hard-scrabble cottage manner. A real operation, Briggs said, looking down from his horse. Hundreds of head, proper buildings. A man could corner the whole trade, with means enough behind him. He smiled. You've shown there's money in it, Mrs. Doyle. I'll give you that. You've shown the way. Be a shame if the proving of it was all you got. Margaret understood the threat folded inside the courtesy. Briggs meant to take the trade she had invented and crush her small share of it under the weight of his money. He could buy 300 goats where she had 37. He could build a stone dairy and hire cheesemakers and flood Boggs and the camps with cheese until the Doyle wheels were a forgotten curiosity. But Briggs, for all his money, had a flaw, and Margaret saw it as she stood looking up at him. He did not understand the thing he meant to copy. He thought the secret was the goats. He thought any goat on any grass would give that milk, and any hired hand could press that cheese. He did not know that the richness came from the wild forage of the high, rough ground, the very ground he despised, that his fat lowland goats grazing Timothy would give ordinary milk and ordinary cheese. He did not know that the keeping quality came from 100 small disciplines of salt and pressing and patient turning that Margaret and the widow had worked out by hand and could not be bought in a hurry. He did not know these things, but Margaret feared he would learn them, given time and money. And she feared, too, the more immediate trouble. Briggs began, that very week, to make the Doyles' life difficult in small, mean ways. A water right that had always been shared came suddenly into dispute, Briggs claiming the upper creek that watered the Doyle herd in the dry months. A note Aaron had signed years before, held by the bank where Briggs sat on the board, was abruptly called due. $30, payable by the 1st of September, or the 40 acres forfeit. $30. They had Boggs's silver and a cellar refilling with cheese. But $30 all at once, with the herd needing feed, supplement in the worst of the drought and the family needing to eat, was a wall. He means to choke us out before we can grow, Aaron said that night, his old fear come back into his face. Take the water, call the note, and buy the land for back taxes when we fold. Then take the trade for himself. Margaret looked into the fire. Then we don't fold, she said. We grow faster than he can choke. The next weeks were the hardest of Margaret's life, and the best, though she could not have said why both were true at once until much later. She and Aaron and the widow Pruitt worked the dairy from dark to dark. Every drop of milk the herd gave became cheese. Not a cupful was wasted. Margaret pressed more wheels than she had thought her hands could manage, and her hands cracked and bled at the knuckles, and she wrapped them in muslin and pressed on. Aaron built a second press, then a third, working scrap oak by lantern light after the herd was bedded. The widow brined the rinds and turned the aging wheels and minded the boy, who minded the kids in the corral. Every pair of hands in the family of 3 households bent to the one task. Boggs came every week, and every week took all they had and asked for more, and paid in silver. And the silver went into the sock beneath the floorboard, and the sock grew fat where it had grown thin. But $30 all at once by September 1st was still $30. And the drought made everything cost more, and the water dispute meant Aaron had to haul water in barrels from the low creek 2 miles distant, hours stolen from the work each day. Briggs watched and waited. He had, Margaret learned, sent away for goats of his own, 100 head due in the autumn, and had begun building a stone dairy on his bottomland, hiring 2 men away from a Wisconsin cheese house at wages the Doyles could never match. He was, just as she had feared, setting himself to learn the disciplines and flood the trade. He had the means to wait out a poor first season and crush her with a better second one. The valley assumed the Doyles were finished. It was understood, in the way such things are understood, that Briggs had decided to take this trade for his own, and that no poor family could stand against him. Pratt at the store grew cooler. 2 families who had begun, shyly, to ask Margaret how she made her cheese, stopped asking, not wanting to be caught on the losing side. But there was one thing Briggs's money could not buy, and it was the thing that saved them, though it came disguised as a disaster. In the last week of August, with the heat still pressing and Briggs's stone dairy half built on the bottoms, a sickness moved through the valley's cattle. A fever bred of the heat and the foul, low water and the close, crowded, gaunt herds. It struck the bottomland hard. Briggs lost 40 head in a week and stood to lose more, and every hand and every dollar he had set toward his goat scheme was wrenched back to saving his cattle, the foundation of all his wealth. The stone dairy stood unfinished. The hired Wisconsin men were put to nursing 6 steers. His 100 goats, when they came, would come to a man with no time to learn what to do with them. The Doyle goats, high on the rough, dry slopes, drinking from the upper creek, eating the deep-rooted wild forage, never took the fever at all. Still, the note remained, and the water dispute remained, and September 1st drew on. Margaret counted the silver in the sock one evening by candlelight, Aaron and the widow watching, the boy asleep in the corner. Boggs's payments had brought them, with everything they could scrape, to $26 and some cents. $4 short, with 2 days to find it, and nothing left to sell but the herd itself. And to sell the herd was to sell the future to save the present, the worst trade of all. "We could sell 6 of the older nannies," Aaron said quietly. "Make the note. Start the herd back up come spring, and give Briggs the satisfaction, and weaken the herd just when the trade is growing." Margaret pressed her cracked hands flat on the table. There has to be another way. But for the first time that summer, looking at the small heap of silver that was $4 short of safety, she could not see what it was. The blow fell from a direction she had not guarded. A storm broke that night. The first real rain in 2 months, violent and sudden, hammering the dry hills. By morning, the low creek had flooded its banks, and the road to Caldwell's Crossing was a river of mud. Boggs could not get his wagon through. He sent word by a rider. He could not come for a week, perhaps 2, until the roads dried and the freight backed up behind the flood could move. No Boggs meant no payment. No payment meant the sock stayed $4 short. The note came due in 2 days, flood or no flood, and Briggs and his bank would not wait on the weather. The thing she had built was about to be taken. Margaret sat on the porch step in the wet dawn while the others slept, and let herself, for 1 hour, feel the full weight of it. She had been so sure. She had stood in that stockyard and trusted what she saw in those sickly goats when every soul around her laughed. And she had been right, gloriously right. The cheese had kept, and the trade was real, and the camps were hungry, and her hands had made something true out of nothing at all. And it would all be taken by a man with more money and meaner aims, taken on a technicality of $30 in a summer when she had earned far more than $30, brought down not by being wrong, but by the cruel arithmetic of timing. She thought of her grandmother in Wisconsin, of the goats kept beside the cows, of the country cheese that outlasted the heat. She thought of the thistle bending in the dry wind, tough where the soft grass had burned. There is worth in what the world overlooks. She had built her whole summer on that faith. The rain had stopped. The hills, washed clean, were greening already where the burned grass had been, and it came to her, sitting there, that she had been counting only the silver in the sock and the cheese in the cellar. She had not counted everything she had. She had not counted the herd's worth, or the widow's hands, or the trade's true value, or the friends she did not know she had. She woke Aaron and the widow with the gray light barely up. "We've been thinking like poor people," she said, "counting pennies into a sock, hoping to scrape just past Briggs's wall. But we're not poor anymore. We have a trade every man in this valley now knows is real. We have a cellar full of a thing that doesn't spoil. That's as good as money. Better, because it keeps. And Briggs isn't the only man with means in this county." She was already pulling on her boots. "Boggs can't reach us, but we can reach the bank, and we're going to walk in there owing nothing and offering something." The plan came together fast, once Margaret stopped trying to fit through Briggs's narrow door and went looking for a wider one. The cellar held more than 24 aged wheels. Boggs's coming order, worth, at the price he paid, far more than $30. Cheese did not spoil. That was the whole miracle of it. So the cheese was not merely food. It was wealth that kept. The trouble was only that she could not turn it to coin before September 1st, with Boggs stranded behind the flood. Unless she did not need coin at all. She loaded the wagon with the finest wheels in the cellar, a dozen of them, gold-rinded and ringing firm, and she drove, the low road being washed out, up over the rough high ground her goats grazed, the only path the flood had left passable, a thing she noted with a grim, small satisfaction. Aaron drove. She sat with the cheese. They went first, not to the bank, but to the mining road, where the freight had backed up behind the flood. A dozen teamsters and their loaded wagons stalled at the swollen ford, men bound for the hungry camps with no food that would survive the wait. Boggs had told the whole fraternity of freighters about the cheese that traveled. Now here were a dozen of them, idle and provisioned with bread already molding and meat already turning in the wet heat. Margaret cut a wheel open on the wagon gate and let them taste. She sold 8 wheels before noon for hard silver and a fair price to men who could not believe their luck, a food that would ride to the camps and arrive the better for the journey. She took orders for more against the week to come, and the teamsters, grateful, spread her name up and down the stalled line. By the time the wagon rattled toward Caldwell's Crossing, the sock held not $26, but better than 40, and the seller's worth was proven in coin before witnesses. But Margaret was not finished, and this was the part that turned the whole game. She did not go to the bank to beg an extension or pay the note and limp away. She went to pay the note in full, in silver, on the counter, in front of the clerk and the 2 directors who happened to be in the office. And then, with the paid note in her hand and the morning's sales fresh on every freighter's tongue, she made the directors an offer. She would expand. She would build a proper dairy on her own rough high ground, not stone. She could not afford stone, but sound and clean and large enough to triple her pressing. She would buy the Springs kids from 2 struggling families in the valley, families the drought had hurt, and put their idle hands to work and their hungry mouths to use. She had a buyer in Boggs and a dozen more in the stalled freighters and a market in every mining camp in the hills that no cattle ruined by fever could ever feed. She wanted a loan, A real one, a business loan, secured against a trade the whole county had watched. Survived the worst summer in 20 years. The directors knew arithmetic. They had watched Briggs lose 40 head of cattle to the fever, while his half-built dairy stood idle. They had watched the butter money of the whole valley melt in the heat. And here stood a woman laying silver on their counter, earned from a food that did not spoil, with orders in her pocket and a herd that had not taken sick. One trade in the valley had made money that summer. Only one. They were bankers. They knew which way to lean. They gave her the loan. And one of the directors, a quiet man named Hollis, who had never laughed at the auction because he had not been there, and who had a merchant's clean eye for what worked, asked whether she might want a partner with capital rather than only a creditor. Margaret said she would consider it, and meant it, and the considering of it would in time make all of them comfortable. Howell Briggs learned of all this by the afternoon, the valley's tongues being what they were. He rode to the bank in a fury and found the note paid, the loan made, and the directors disinclined to discuss it. His own scheme lay in ruins, his cattle sick, his dairy unfinished, his hired Wisconsin men nursing steers, his 100 goats due to arrive to a man with no time and no knowledge to use them. He had tried to take a trade he did not understand, and the understanding, it turned out, was the whole of it. He came to the Doyle place one last time, and this time he got down off his horse, which Margaret marked. He did not apologize. Men like Briggs rarely could. But he asked stiffly whether she might sell him some of her stock, her bloodlines, her healthy herd, and whether she might advise his men on the making of the cheese. He offered a fair price. He had decided, having failed to crush her, that the next best thing was to deal with her. Margaret looked at him a long moment, the man who had laughed loudest in the stockyard. "I'll sell you breeding stock," she said, "at a fair price, and I'll teach your men, for a fee, the way of the cheese." She paused. "But the milk comes from the wild forage on the rough high ground, Mr. Briggs, not the bottoms. Your fat lowland grass will give you fat, ordinary milk. If you want what I make, you'll have to value the ground you've spent your life despising." She let that sit. There's room in this trade for more than one. The camps are hungry enough for all of us. I'd rather have a neighbor than an enemy. But you'll do it my way, on my terms, or you'll do it badly alone. It was not in Briggs to like it, but he was a businessman before he was a proud man in the end, and he took her hand on the deal. By the first frost, the new dairy stood finished on the high ground. 3 families worked it. The widow Pruitt ran the aging cellar and drew a wage and held, by Margaret's insistence, a small share of the whole. And the silver came in steady from the hills, all winter, from a food that would not spoil. The following August, 2 summers from the stockyard, Margaret stood in the courthouse while 3 judges cut into her wheel at the First Valley Agricultural Fair. They tasted, they conferred. They awarded the blue ribbon for finest cheese to the Doyle Dairy, and the crowd of 100 ranchers, the same men who had laughed, applauded because there was nothing else left to do. Aaron stood beside her, no longer ashamed of anything. Out past the courthouse, the high, rough slopes she had been mocked for buying were green with a herd grown to 200 head, browsing the wild forage no cow would touch. The thistle bent in the dry wind, tough where the soft grass had burned. Margaret pressed her cracked, healed hands flat against her apron and smiled.